Have you ever been the target of a crazy rumor? Imagine waking up one day and finding out the whole town is talking about you, and not in a good way. Now, picture this. Your belly starts growing rapidly, and suddenly, people are whispering shocking theories behind your back. That's exactly what happened to Emily, a young woman living on a peaceful farm in Texas. What started as small-town gossip quickly turned into a nightmare. What's really happening to Emily? Are the rumors true? Or is there an even bigger secret behind it all? Stick around because this story will leave you speechless. And before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more incredible stories. Now, let's begin. Emily Carter had always been known for her deep love for animals. Growing up on a farm just outside of Wichita Falls, Texas, she had spent her childhood surrounded by horses, cattle, and dogs, forming a bond with them that only a few could understand. Now, in her late 20s, she lived with her husband, John, on a modest ranch inherited from his grandfather. Their lives were simple, filled with hard work, early mornings, and quiet evenings watching the sun set over the vast Texan plains. But among all the animals she had cared for in her life, Rex was different. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had been a part of her life since he was a tiny pup, abandoned on the side of a dirt road during a thunderstorm. Emily had found him cold and trembling, barely breathing, and had nursed him back to health. Since then, he had become her shadow, following her across the fields, waiting at the barn doors, and curling up beside her feet in the evenings. John, a tall and broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, worked long hours managing the farm. He adored Emily's love for animals, though he sometimes worried she cared more for them than herself. "You'd take in the whole damn prairie if you could," he would joke, watching her bring in yet another stray. Emily would just smile and shake her head, knowing he wasn't entirely wrong. Their life was steady, predictable, and peaceful, until something strange started happening. The first signs one morning, Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her fingers resting on her abdomen. It was rounder, not just slightly bloated from a heavy meal, but visibly different. At first, she thought she had gained weight, which wasn't unusual since she had been less active lately, feeling more fatigued than usual. "John," she called, stepping into their small but cozy bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on his boots, his brow furrowed as he glanced up. "Yeah. Do I look different to you?" She lifted her shirt slightly, revealing her stomach. John squinted, tilting his head before standing up and walking over. He placed his rough, calloused hands on her waist and examined her belly closely. Yeah, you do look a little different," he admitted cautiously. "You sure you ain't pregnant?" Emily let out a nervous laugh. "I don't think so. I mean, I'd know, right?" John shrugged. "Wouldn't hurt to check, Em," she sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I guess I could stop by the pharmacy later." Rex, lying near the doorway, lifted his head, ears perked up. His golden brown eyes studied them carefully, almost as if he understood the conversation. "You think I should be worried, boy?" Emily asked with a small smile, scratching behind his ears. The dog licked her hand in response, then rested his head back down. She didn't realize then how wrong things would soon go. Rumors begin small-town life had its charms. Everyone knew everyone, neighbors looked out for one another, and the sense of community was strong. But it also had its drawbacks. Gossip traveled faster than wildfire. It started when Emily went into town to grab a pregnancy test. She barely noticed the way Mrs. Phillips, the elderly cashier at the local store, watched her stomach with an overly curious gaze. "How's that husband of yours?" the woman asked, bagging the items slowly. "John's good," Emily replied, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. "And the dog?" Mrs. Phillips added, her tone shifting slightly. Emily blinked. "Rex? He's fine." The older woman gave a tight-lipped smile. You'll have a good day now." It wasn't until later that Emily heard the whispers. At the diner, at the feed store, even at church. "Did you hear about Emily Carter? They say she's pregnant, but no one's seen her at the doctor's office. And that dog of hers, always near her, never lets anyone close. You don't think? Don't be ridiculous. But still strange, ain't it?" At first, she brushed it off. People in small towns needed something to talk about. But soon, the stares became more obvious. The cashier at the gas station hesitated before handing back her change. Her hairstylist kept looking at her through the mirror. Even John noticed. "Something's up, Em," he muttered one night over dinner. "People are acting weird around you." She swallowed hard. "I know," John sighed, running a hand through his short brown hair. "You want me to say something?" Emily shook her head. "Let them talk. It's just nonsense." She wanted to believe that, but she had no idea how much worse it was going to get. Emily had always known that living in a small town came with its share of gossip. She'd grown up hearing whispered stories at the church potlucks, seeing old ladies lean in close at the diner, their voices hushed as they discussed someone else's business. But this time, she was the story. At first, it was just subtle things. Longer than usual glances at the grocery store, the way conversations seemed to die the moment she entered a room. Then, the whispers became louder. She heard them at the farmer's market, where she and John sold fresh eggs and homemade preserves. "Did you hear about Emily Carter? They say she hasn't been to a doctor, and that dog of hers? Always by her side." Emily pretended not to hear, her fingers tightening around the jar of strawberry jam she was handing to a customer. "It's just gossip. Ignore it." But then, things got worse. A confrontation at the diner. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Emily decided she couldn't avoid town forever. She had planned to meet John for lunch at Ruby's Diner, a small but popular spot on Main Street where everyone gathered for coffee, gossip, and homemade pie. When she walked through the door, the entire room seemed to pause for just a second. Conversations dipped, eyes flickered toward her, and then, just as quickly, people went back to their meals. She forced herself to act normal, smiling at Ruby behind the counter. "Hey, hon," Ruby greeted her. But there was something different in her tone, something careful. Emily sat at their usual booth by the window, waiting for John. She scrolled through her phone, trying to block out the hushed voices around her. Then, she heard her name. "I just don't know what to think," someone murmured. "She won't see a doctor, won't talk about the father. It's strange." Emily's grip on her phone tightened. I mean, her husband's always working. And that dog, the sound of ceramic scraping against wood made everyone look up. Emily had shoved her coffee cup aside and stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the voices, two women she knew very well. Melissa Turner and June Callahan, both longtime town residents, both self-appointed judges of everyone else's business. Melissa turned red immediately, but June only folded her arms, not the least bit ashamed of being caught. "You got something you want to say to my face?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the rage bubbling inside her. June tilted her head. "Well, since you're asking, why don't you just tell people the truth?" Emily narrowed her eyes. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Melissa squirmed in her seat. "June, maybe we shouldn't. People are worried," June pressed, ignoring Melissa. "A woman like you, pregnant and acting all secretive, never seeing a doctor? And that dog of yours," Emily snapped. "You think my dog has something to do with my pregnancy?" she demanded, her voice sharp. June didn't flinch. "People talk." Emily laughed, but it wasn't out of amusement. It was pure disbelief. "Jesus Christ, you think. What? That I?" She ran a hand through her hair. "That's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard." "Then prove it," June said simply. "Go see a doctor. Shut everyone up." Emily stared at her, a mixture of shock and fury twisting inside her. "I don't owe you or anyone else a damn thing." By now, the entire diner was silent. Even Ruby, who normally kept things running smoothly, just stood frozen behind the counter. John chose that exact moment to walk in. He looked between his wife, fuming, fists clenched, and the two women in the booth. "What's going on?" Emily shook her head, grabbing her purse. "Nothing. We're leaving." John didn't argue. He just threw down some cash for the coffee she hadn't touched and followed her out. The breaking point back in the truck, Emily could barely sit still. "I cannot believe this," she muttered, staring out the window as John pulled onto the road. John gripped the wheel tightly. "What happened in there?" Emily let out a harsh laugh. "They think I'm hiding something. They actually," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. They think my pregnancy has something to do with Rex. John nearly slammed on the brakes. What? You heard me. Silence filled the truck. John's jaw tightened. Emily, this has to stop. She turned to him. What am I supposed to do? They've already made up their minds. Nothing I say is going to change that. John ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You need to see a doctor. Emily tensed. John. No, listen to me. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I don't give a damn what those women think. But you've been exhausted, your stomach's growing fast, and you haven't had a single checkup. She swallowed hard. What if something's wrong? John reached over, squeezing her hand. Then we deal with it. Together. Emily bit her lip, nodding. Neither of them noticed Rex, sitting in the back seat, his golden eyes watching them carefully. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling worse than ever. Her body felt heavy, her head pounded, and the dull ache in her stomach had become a sharp, twisting pain. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand against her swollen abdomen. The sight made her heart pound. It was bigger than yesterday. She wasn't imagining it. John was already awake, standing by the dresser, buttoning his flannel shirt. When he turned and saw the look on her face, his brow furrowed. You okay? Emily hesitated. She wanted to lie, to tell him she just needed rest, that the stress from yesterday was getting to her. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes scanning her face. Tell me what's wrong, Em. Emily swallowed hard. My stomach, it's bigger, and I feel like I can't catch my breath. John placed his palm gently over her belly. It was warm, too warm, and felt unnaturally firm beneath his touch. That's it, he said firmly. We're going to a doctor today. No arguments. Emily exhaled slowly. Okay. John blinked. Wait, did you just agree with me? A weak smile played on her lips. Don't get used to it. A loyal shadow as Emily got dressed. Rex stayed glued to her side. He moved when she moved, watching her with those deep, intelligent eyes. You're being extra clingy today, boy, she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Rex whined softly and nudged her hand, his body tense. John shook his head as he grabbed his car keys. I swear, that dog acts like he understands every damn word we say. He probably does, Emily muttered, heading toward the door. As they stepped outside, the morning air was thick with humidity, a storm brewing in the distance. Emily shivered despite the warmth. John locked up the house and led her to the truck, but when she opened the passenger door, Rex jumped in first, planting himself firmly on the seat. Rex, move, John ordered. The dog didn't budge. He let out a low, stubborn huff, his ears pinned back. Emily sighed. Let him come, John. John exhaled sharply but didn't argue. Fine, but if he pukes in my truck, he's sleeping outside for a week. Rex thumped his tail but kept his eyes locked on Emily, as if sensing something neither of them could. The drive to Dallas, the nearest clinic, was in town, but John refused to take her there. After what happened at the diner, he didn't trust the local doctors to treat Emily fairly. We're going to Dallas, he announced, gripping the wheel tightly. I want you to see a specialist. Emily leaned her head against the window, exhaustion pressing down on her. That's a 3-hour drive, and I don't care. She gave a small nod, watching the endless stretch of dusty roads and cattle fences pass by. About an hour in, she dozed off, lulled by the rhythm of the road. When she stirred awake, she heard John arguing with someone on the phone. I don't give a damn about your schedule, he snapped. She needs to be seen today. Emily blinked groggily. Who is that? John covered the speaker. The doctor's office. She frowned. John, I'm not waiting a week for some appointment, Em. Something's not right. There was a desperation in his voice that she hadn't heard before, a tension in his shoulders that made her realize he was scared. Rex, curled up in the back seat, suddenly sat up, his ears twitching. He let out a soft growl. Emily turned toward the window. A black SUV was trailing behind them. Her stomach dropped. A troubling coincidence, John, she said cautiously. We've had that same car behind us for the last 15 minutes. John flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. His jaw clenched. You sure? Yeah. I saw it back near that gas station. John slowed slightly, watching the SUV in the mirror. It slowed too. Son of a bitch, he muttered. Emily's pulse quickened. Why would someone follow us? John exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't know, but I don't like it. The SUV sped up and changed lanes, moving beside them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She could see the driver now. A man wearing sunglasses, face unreadable. Rex let out a deep, rumbling growl from the back seat, his fur bristling. Easy, boy, John muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the SUV turned off onto a side road, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Emily let out a shaky breath. That was weird. John nodded but said nothing, his grip still tight on the wheel. They rode in silence the rest of the way to Dallas, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And neither could Rex. The hospital visit, when they finally pulled into the Dallas Medical Center, Emily felt her nerves spike. She had avoided this for too long. Now it was real. John helped her inside, his grip steady on her arm. The waiting room was cold, the smell of disinfectant strong. She hated hospitals. Rex sat obediently by her feet, watching the nurses carefully. A few people stared, but Emily didn't care. A nurse called her name. Emily Carter? She took a deep breath. Here. John squeezed her hand. I'll be right here. She nodded and followed the nurse down the hall, not realizing how much her life was about to change. The hospital room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Emily sat on the edge of the examination table, her fingers gripping the thin fabric of her hospital gown. Her stomach felt tight, unnaturally heavy, and though she was trying to stay calm, her pulse thumped loudly in her ears. John sat in a chair against the wall, his leg bouncing impatiently. His calloused hands were clasped together, knuckles white. He hated hospitals, hated waiting. Rex, who had been forced to stay outside due to hospital policy, had put up a hell of a fight. The dog had refused to leave Emily's side, barking and resisting until John had to drag him out the door. I've never seen him act like that, Emily whispered. John exhaled. Yeah, neither have I. The door swung open, and Dr. Mitchell, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and neatly combed gray hair, stepped inside holding a clipboard. His expression was unreadable. Mrs. Carter, he greeted with a nod, before glancing at John. Mr. Carter. John sat up straighter. Document, tell us what's going on. Dr. Mitchell took a seat on the rolling stool, flipping through the pages in front of him. We ran the ultrasound and several blood tests to rule out different conditions. The results were unexpected. Emily's throat went dry. What do you mean? The doctor sighed, adjusting his glasses. First, congratulations. You're pregnant with twins. Emily blinked. Twins? John let out a stunned breath, his hand running through his hair. Jesus. A small part of Emily should have felt joy, relief. But there was something about the way Dr. Mitchell had said it. There's more, isn't there? She asked. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said carefully. Your pregnancy isn't the only reason your abdomen is growing so rapidly. We found something else. Silence thickened the air. What do you mean, something else? John asked, his voice sharp with worry. Dr. Mitchell turned the clipboard around and pointed at the ultrasound images. This mass here, it's not a baby. It's a tumor. Emily stopped breathing. John stiffened beside her, his body going rigid. A tumor? Dr. Mitchell nodded. It's large and pressing against several of your organs. That's likely what's been causing your fatigue, shortness of breath, and rapid abdominal swelling. Emily swallowed hard. Is it cancer? We don't know yet. We'll need a biopsy to determine if it's malignant, but regardless, its size alone is concerning. John shot to his feet. So what the hell do we do? Dr. Mitchell held up a hand. Let's take this one step at a time. Given how aggressive the tumor appears, the safest option would be surgical removal. But, he hesitated, glancing at Emily, that would mean terminating the pregnancy. The room went dead silent. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. John staggered backward, his back hitting the wall. No, he said immediately. No way. Dr. Mitchell's voice remained calm. I know this isn't easy, but with the tumor growing as fast as it is, delaying surgery could put your life in jeopardy. Emily stared blankly at the ultrasound images, her mind racing. Her babies, the ones she hadn't even known about until today. Tears burned her eyes. There's no other way? The doctor hesitated. We can try monitoring the tumor for a few weeks to see if we can safely delay surgery, but if it continues to grow, it could start compressing your lungs, your liver, your heart. You might not have the strength to carry the pregnancy to term. Emily felt like she was drowning. John pressed a hand to his mouth, visibly shaken. He turned away, staring at the wall, his breathing uneven. Dr. Mitchell softened his tone. You don't have to decide right now. I just want you to understand the risks. Emily could barely hear him. Her heart thundered in her chest, her hands shaking. She had 2 lives growing inside her, and a tumor that might kill her before they were born. She looked at John. His blue eyes were glassy, filled with a fear she had never seen before. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw. We'll find another way. Emily clutched her stomach, her entire body trembling. She didn't know how, but she had to try. The drive back home from Dallas Medical Center was eerily silent. The weight of the diagnosis sat heavy between them, a crushing presence that neither knew how to face. Emily sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the vast, open field stretching beyond the road. Her fingers absently traced small circles over her swollen belly, as if trying to comfort the 2 tiny lives growing inside her. Her babies. John gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes remained locked on the road ahead. But every so often, his grip would tighten, like he was trying to keep himself together. Rex sat in the back seat, unusually tense. Every time the truck hit a small bump, his ears flicked up, his golden brown eyes locked on Emily as if he could sense the turmoil inside her. It wasn't until they were halfway home that John finally spoke. Emily. His voice was hoarse, like he had been holding back a storm. Tell me you're not actually considering waiting this out. She swallowed hard. I don't know, John. His hands flexed on the wheel. We're talking about your life, Em. You heard the doctor. If this thing keeps growing, you... His voice broke slightly, and he quickly shook his head. I can't lose you. Emily closed her eyes, pressing a hand over her mouth as she tried to breathe through the fear suffocating her. I don't want to die, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. John inhaled sharply. Then let's do the surgery. But what about them? She looked down at her stomach, fresh tears forming. John, there are babies. His expression twisted with pain. I know, he murmured, but you're my wife. I can't. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel so tightly it creaked. I can't live in a world without you, Em. Silence stretched between them. Emily understood. She knew that if their positions were reversed, she'd be begging him to do the surgery too. But how could she make that choice? How could she decide which lives mattered more? Tears slipped down her face as she turned back toward the window. I just need time. John didn't argue. He just nodded tightly and kept driving. But Emily knew time wasn't on her side. The weight of gossip by the time they pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light over the ranch. It should have been beautiful, peaceful. Instead, the moment they stepped out of the truck, John cursed under his breath. Emily followed his gaze toward their front porch. A group of people stood gathered near the steps. Neighbors. Melissa Turner, June Callahan, even Sheriff Davis. The sight of them made Emily's stomach churn. She already knew why they were here. John squared his shoulders and stormed toward them. What the hell is this? June didn't flinch. We're just concerned, John. Emily felt Rex's body tense beside her. He let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. Sheriff Davis raised a hand. Let's keep this civil. Nobody's accusing anyone of anything. Could have fooled me, John snapped. Emily took a slow breath and stepped forward. If you have something to say, just say it. June folded her arms. All right. Are you pregnant? Emily stiffened. Why does that matter to you? June exchanged looks with Melissa before sighing. Look, Emily, people are talking. You've been sick. You've avoided the doctor. And then there's your dog. Rex's growl grew louder. John's temper snapped. If you're standing on my porch implying what I think you are, I swear to God, John, Emily whispered, grabbing his arm. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. We just want the truth. Emily exhaled sharply, her entire body shaking with exhaustion. She was tired. Tired of the whispers. Tired of the looks. Tired of people thinking they had a right to question her life. So she lifted her chin and looked them all in the eye. Yes, I'm pregnant. With twins. A few gasps rippled through the group. But I'm also sick, she continued, voice raw. I have a tumor. That's why I've been avoiding doctors. Because I'm trying to figure out if I have to choose between saving my babies or saving myself. Silence. Melissa's face drained of color. June shifted uncomfortably. Even Sheriff Davis had the decency to look ashamed. John glared at them. Still want to spread your damn rumors? No one said a word. Emily took a shaky breath. You can all leave now. One by one, they did. But as June turned to go, she hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she muttered, I'm sorry. Emily didn't respond. She just walked into the house, Rex following close behind, and shut the door. A midnight decision that night. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. John was beside her, one arm draped protectively over her stomach, his breathing deep and steady. He was asleep, but she knew he hadn't really rested in days. She turned onto her side, pressing her palm over her abdomen. I'm sorry, little ones, she whispered. I wish I had more time. A lump formed in her throat. Then, she felt movement. Her breath caught. It was the first time she had felt them kick. A sob slipped from her lips as another small thump met her palm. They were fighting, and so would she. Her mind was made up. She reached for John's hand and squeezed it. His eyes fluttered open, groggy. Em? She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. I'm keeping them, she whispered. No matter what happens to me. John sat up, his heart breaking in his eyes. Emily, I know the risks, she murmured, voice shaking. But I need to try. He exhaled shakily, cupping her face. I can't lose you. You won't. Neither of them believed that. But it was the choice she had made. Rex, curled up at the foot of the bed, let out a soft whine, almost as if he understood. And in the silence of the night, Emily prayed that she had made the right decision. The days following Emily's decision felt like a slow, aching countdown toward an uncertain future. John did his best to keep her comfortable, but there was no comfort in knowing that time was working against them. The tumor was still growing, pressing against her organs, making breathing difficult and simple tasks exhausting. The worst part? She was in constant pain. At first, she hid it well, smiling through the discomfort, pretending that everything was fine. But John saw through her, and so did Rex. A quiet house, Emily sat in the living room one evening, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs. The windows were open, letting in the warm Texas breeze, but even the fresh air couldn't ease the tightness in her chest. John had been in the kitchen for nearly an hour, making her a bowl of soup she had no appetite for. Rex sat at her feet, his golden eyes locked onto her. He never left her side anymore. You're worrying me, boy, she murmured, reaching down to scratch his ears. He pressed his nose against her palm, letting out a low, soft whine. John emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray. You need to eat something, Em. She sighed. I'm not hungry. John set the tray down, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. The man who once carried the weight of the farm on his shoulders now looked like he was barely holding himself together. Emily hated that she was the reason. Emily, he said quietly, sitting down beside her. I know you don't want to hear this, but you're getting worse. She tensed. John? No, listen to me, he said firmly, taking her hand in his. You can't even walk across the room without struggling to breathe. You can't keep food down. Your body is fighting a battle, and it's losing. She bit her lip, holding back tears. John's grip tightened. I love you, and I love these babies. But if you don't do something soon, Emily pulled away. I've already made my choice. John exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. I know, he muttered, but it's killing me, Em. Watching you suffer like this, she lowered her gaze. I don't know what else to do. John clenched his jaw. Let me take you back to the hospital. Just for another checkup. Please. Emily hesitated. She hated hospitals. But when she looked into John's eyes, she saw pure desperation. Fine, she whispered. But only for a checkup. John let out a breath of relief, but they both knew it wouldn't be that simple. The fainting spell the next morning, Emily barely made it to the front porch before her vision blurred. She wobbled, gripping the railing. But before she could call out to John, her legs gave out. A rush of air filled her ears as the ground came up too fast. She braced for impact, but she never hit the floor. Rex caught her. The massive German shepherd had lunged forward, pressing his body against hers, keeping her upright. John sprinted from the barn the moment he saw her sway. Emily. Her breath was coming in short gasps, her chest burning. John grabbed her, his hands trembling. Jesus Christ, Em. She clung to his arms, her entire body weak and shaking. Rex whined beside her, nudging her leg, frantic. John's face was pale. We're going to the hospital. Now. Emily tried to argue, tried to say she just needed rest. But when she looked at John, she saw tears in his eyes. And that broke her. Okay, she whispered. John didn't waste another second. Back to Dallas John drove like a man on a mission. Emily sat in the passenger seat, struggling to keep her eyes open. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy. Every few minutes, John reached over to check her pulse, muttering curses under his breath when it felt too weak. Rex sat alert in the back seat, his ears pricked forward, watching Emily with unwavering focus. When they arrived at the hospital, John practically carried Emily inside. The nurses took one look at her and rushed her into a room. John wasn't allowed past the doors. He stood there, helpless, his hands shaking. And for the first time since this nightmare started, John broke down. A critical situation. Hours passed before Dr. Mitchell walked into the waiting area, his expression grave. John jumped to his feet. Is she okay? What's happening? Dr. Mitchell sighed. John, I won't sugarcoat this. Emily's condition is deteriorating fast. The tumor has grown significantly in the past week. It's pressing against her lungs, which is why she collapsed. Her oxygen levels are dangerously low. John felt like he was going to throw up. Dr. Mitchell hesitated. She doesn't have much time left, John. John's vision blurred. What are you saying? Dr. Mitchell exhaled. If we don't operate now, she won't survive the next few weeks. And neither will the babies. John's breath hitched. She needs surgery, the doctor continued. But we can try to deliver the babies early. Give them a chance in the NICU. John's legs nearly gave out. Emily was only 7 months along. The babies were too small, too fragile. But if they didn't act, he'd lose all of them. Dr. Mitchell placed a hand on John's shoulder. I need you to talk to her. We don't have much time. John nodded numbly, wiping his face before heading toward Emily's room. The hardest conversation. Emily looked frail in the hospital bed, her skin pale, her lips dry. But the moment she saw John, she smiled weakly. Hey, cowboy, she murmured. John choked back a sob. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. Emily, we have to talk. She saw the fear in his eyes. It's bad, isn't it? John swallowed hard. The tumor's growing too fast. They need to operate. Now. Emily inhaled sharply. John squeezed her hand. But they can deliver the babies first. Put them in the NICU. Tears welled in her eyes. Are they strong enough? I don't know, he whispered. But I can't lose you, Em. And I can't lose them either. She let out a shuddering breath. Then, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. John cried against her hand. And for the first time, Emily felt a flicker of hope. The hospital room buzzed with a quiet urgency as the medical team prepared for the surgery. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air. Emily lay on the operating table, her hands trembling as she clutched John's fingers. This was it. There was no turning back now. Dr. Mitchell stood beside them, his expression calm but serious. Emily, we're going to deliver the babies first. Then we'll begin removing the tumor. Do you understand? Emily nodded. her throat too tight to speak. John leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears slipped from her eyes. "I love you too." A nurse touched John's shoulder. "It's time. You have to wait outside now." John's grip on Emily tightened. "No, I need to be with her." Dr. Mitchell exhaled. "John, we need space to work. You can see her as soon as we're done." John's jaw clenched, his body trembling with frustration and fear. Emily squeezed his hand one last time. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'll be okay." He didn't believe her, but he nodded anyway. With one final, lingering look, John let go and stepped out of the room. The doors closed behind him with a soft, final click, and Emily was alone. The fight for life, the anesthesiologist leaned over her. "Emily, I'm giving you something to help you relax. You'll be awake, but you won't feel any pain." Emily barely nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. As the drugs took effect, her body felt distant, almost floating. "Scalpel," Dr. Mitchell said. Emily stared at the ceiling, her breathing shallow. "Please let them be okay." There was a sharp tugging sensation. Pressure, movement, the surreal feeling of something being lifted away from her. Then, a tiny cry. Emily gasped, her heart stuttering. A nurse's voice rang out. "Baby boy is out." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she turned her head, trying to see. "Is he okay?" "He's small, but he's breathing," Dr. Mitchell assured her. "Let's get his sister." More movement, more hands, more pressure. Then, a second cry. Emily sobbed. "Baby girl is out," the nurse called. Her babies were here. A blurry figure, a doctor, lifted them briefly so she could see. They were tiny, fragile, their little chests rising and falling with labored breaths. Then, in a blur, they were whisked away to the NICU. Emily let out a shaky breath. "Please survive. Please stay." Dr. Mitchell's voice turned grave. "All right, let's move fast. We need to remove the tumor now." Emily felt the weight of exhaustion press down on her. She tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but everything faded to black. John's longest wait. John sat in the waiting room, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. Rex sat beside him, silent but tense, his ears pinned back. The dog hadn't stopped pacing earlier, only settling when John finally sat down. "Come on, Em," John muttered under his breath. The minutes dragged into an hour, then two. Every time the doors swung open, John's heart leapt into his throat. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Dr. Mitchell walked in. John shot to his feet, his chest tight. "Tell me." The doctor hesitated. John's stomach dropped. No, don't do that. Just tell me." Dr. Mitchell exhaled. "The babies are stable. They're in the NICU, and while they're premature, they're fighters." John let out a breath, his hands shaking. But then the doctor's face darkened. "Emily," he began. John's heart stopped. "She lost a lot of blood, John. The tumor was pressing against several major vessels. We had to remove it quickly, and she started hemorrhaging." John staggered back. "But she's alive?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mitchell's expression was carefully measured. "She's in the ICU, but she's in critical condition." John couldn't breathe. "She needs time to recover," the doctor continued. "But I won't lie to you. The next 24 hours are crucial." John felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Dr. Mitchell's voice softened. "You can see her now." John didn't wait. A fragile hope. The ICU was dimly lit, machines beeping softly. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her skin pale, an oxygen mask over her face, and 4 in her arm. She looked so small, so fragile. John sat beside her, taking her cold hand in his. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The babies are here. They're okay." Emily didn't stir. John swallowed hard, pressing her hand to his lips. "I need you to wake up, Em. I need you to fight." Rex let out a soft whine, pressing his head against John's knee. John wiped his face, his body trembling. "Come back to me, baby. Please." Emily's fingers twitched. John's breath caught. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it. She whispered his name. John let out a broken laugh, relief crashing over him. Emily was still here, and she was fighting. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. John sat beside Emily's hospital bed, his fingers wrapped around hers, unwilling to let go. Her skin felt cold, too cold, and her breathing was shallow beneath the oxygen mask. Rex sat at his feet, his golden brown eyes locked on Emily. The dog had been silent since they entered the room, his body tense, ears flicking every time the machines beeped. John hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. His wife lay before him, fighting for her life. His newborn children were down the hall, hooked up to tubes and monitors, too small, too fragile. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life. A whisper in the dark. John leaned in, pressing his lips against Emily's knuckles. Baby, I need you to wake up." She didn't move. His throat tightened. "The babies are okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it. They're in the NICU, and the doctors say they're fighters." A long pause. Then, her fingers twitched. John shot up. "Emily?" Her eyelids fluttered. A weak groan escaped her lips. John squeezed her hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Come back to me." Emily's eyes slowly cracked open, unfocused, dazed. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then, her gaze cleared, and she whispered, "John?" John let out a breath that he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest ached with relief. "Yeah, baby, I'm here." Emily tried to move, but her body was weak. She blinked, her breathing uneven. "The babies?" John swallowed hard. "They're okay, Em. They're tiny, but they're fighting." Tears welled in her tired eyes. "I want to see them." John brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You will, sweetheart. I promise." She nodded slightly, her eyelids fluttering closed again. John watched her, his heart pounding. She was still weak, but she was awake, and that meant she had a chance. The doctor's verdict. Dr. Mitchell walked in an hour later, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral. John immediately straightened. "How is she?" The doctor sighed. "She made it through the worst of it, but she's not out of the woods yet." John clenched his jaw. "What does that mean?" Dr. Mitchell glanced at Emily, who was still asleep, then turned back to John. "The surgery was successful. We removed the tumor entirely, but the blood loss weakened her significantly. She needs to regain her strength. The next few days will be critical." John nodded, his heart still uneasy. "And the cancer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mitchell hesitated. John's stomach dropped. "Just tell me." The doctor exhaled. "We'll need further tests, but from what we saw, there's a high chance it was benign." John's knees nearly buckled. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. Meeting the babies the next day, Emily was strong enough to sit up with assistance. Her body still felt exhausted, but the ache in her chest was nothing compared to the ache in her heart to see her babies. "I need to see them," she whispered again. John pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll get the nurses." 20 minutes later, 2 incubators were wheeled into the room, each carrying a baby so tiny it made Emily's heart break. Tears spilled down her cheeks. The nurse carefully lifted one of them, a fragile, pink bundle with a tiny nasal cannula helping him breathe, and placed him in Emily's arms. "This is your son," the nurse murmured. Emily let out a small, choked sob. His skin was soft, his chest rising and falling with effort, but he was warm. So warm. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm your mama." John leaned over, looking at their son, his eyes glassy with emotion. Then the nurse placed their daughter in his arms. John sucked in a sharp breath. "She's perfect," he whispered. Emily smiled, tears blurring her vision. "What should we name them?" John looked down at his son, his tiny hands curling into fists. "How about Caleb?" Emily nodded. "I love it." She turned to their daughter, the smallest of the two, but full of quiet strength. "Charlotte," she whispered. John smiled. "Caleb and Charlotte." Emily let out a soft laugh. "They sound strong together." John kissed her temple. "Just like their mama." A new beginning that night. Emily held Caleb in her arms, watching him sleep peacefully. John sat beside her, Charlotte resting against his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Rex sat at their feet, his ears twitching as he watched the babies with curiosity. Emily reached down, stroking his fur. "You watched over me," she murmured. Rex licked her hand gently, as if saying, "I always will." John let out a slow breath, his arms tightening around his daughter. It wasn't over yet. The baby still had a long road ahead in the NICU. Emily still needed to recover. But for the first time, there was hope, and that was enough. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. John sat beside Emily's hospital bed, his fingers wrapped around hers, unwilling to let go. Her skin felt cold, too cold, and her breathing was shallow beneath the oxygen mask. Rex sat at his feet, his golden brown eyes locked on Emily. The dog had been silent since they entered the room, his body tense, ears flicking every time the machines beeped. John hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. His wife lay before him, fighting for her life. His newborn children were down the hall, hooked up to tubes and monitors, too small, too fragile. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life. A whisper in the dark. John leaned in, pressing his lips against Emily's knuckles. Baby, I need you to wake up." She didn't move. His throat tightened. "The babies are okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it. They're in the NICU, and the doctors say they're fighters." A long pause. Then, her fingers twitched. John shot up. "Emily?" Her eyelids fluttered. A weak groan escaped her lips. John squeezed her hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Come back to me." Emily's eyes slowly cracked open, unfocused, dazed. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then, her gaze cleared, and she whispered, "John?" John let out a breath that he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest ached with relief. "Yeah, baby. I'm here." Emily tried to move, but her body was weak. She blinked, her breathing uneven. "The babies." John swallowed hard. "They're okay, Em. They're tiny, but they're fighting." Tears welled in her tired eyes. "I want to see them." John brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You will, sweetheart. I promise." She nodded slightly, her eyelids fluttering closed again. John watched her, his heart pounding. She was still weak, but she was awake, and that meant she had a chance. The doctor's verdict. Dr. Mitchell walked in an hour later, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral. John immediately straightened. "How is she?" The doctor sighed. "She made it through the worst of it, but she's not out of the woods yet." John clenched his jaw. "What does that mean?" Dr. Mitchell glanced at Emily, who was still asleep, then turned back to John. "The surgery was successful. We removed the tumor entirely, but the blood loss weakened her significantly. She needs to regain her strength. The next few days will be critical." John nodded, his heart still uneasy. "And the cancer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mitchell hesitated. John's stomach dropped. "Just tell me." The doctor exhaled. "We'll need further tests, but from what we saw, there's a high chance it was benign." John's knees nearly buckled. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. Meeting the babies the next day, Emily was strong enough to sit up with assistance. Her body still felt exhausted, but the ache in her chest was nothing compared to the ache in her heart to see her babies. "I need to see them," she whispered again. John pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll get the nurses." 20 minutes later, 2 incubators were wheeled into the room, each carrying a baby so tiny it made Emily's heart break. Tears spilled down her cheeks. The nurse carefully lifted one of them, a fragile, pink bundle with a tiny nasal cannula helping him breathe, and placed him in Emily's arms. "This is your son," the nurse murmured. Emily let out a small, choked sob. His skin was soft, his chest rising and falling with effort, but he was warm. So warm. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm your mama." John leaned over, looking at their son, his eyes glassy with emotion. Then the nurse placed their daughter in his arms. John sucked in a sharp breath. "She's perfect," he whispered. Emily smiled, tears blurring her vision. "What should we name them?" John looked down at his son, his tiny hands curling into fists. "How about Caleb?" Emily nodded. "I love it." She turned to their daughter, the smallest of the two, but full of quiet strength. "Charlotte," she whispered. John smiled. "Caleb and Charlotte." Emily let out a soft laugh. "They sound strong together." John kissed her temple. "Just like their mama." A new beginning that night. Emily held Caleb in her arms, watching him sleep peacefully. John sat beside her, Charlotte resting against his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Rex sat at their feet, his ears twitching as he watched the babies with curiosity. Emily reached down, stroking his fur. "You watched over me," she murmured. Rex licked her hand gently, as if saying, "I always will." John let out a slow breath, his arms tightening around his daughter. It wasn't over yet. The babies still had a long road ahead in the NICU. Emily still needed to recover. But for the first time, there was hope, and that was enough. The morning light seeped through the hospital blinds, casting a soft golden hue across the sterile white walls. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic reminder that Emily was still here. John sat beside her, his fingers wrapped around hers, never letting go. His back ached from sleeping in the stiff hospital chair, but he didn't care, because Emily was alive, and he wasn't going to leave her side. Rex lay curled at his feet, his golden brown eyes fixed on Emily, as if he, too, was waiting for her to wake up. The nurses had long since given up trying to keep the dog out. He belonged there. John squeezed Emily's hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Open those beautiful eyes for me." At first, nothing. Then, her fingers twitched. John shot up, his heart pounding. "Em?" A soft, weak groan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered before slowly cracking open, revealing those familiar, tired blue eyes. John let out a shaky breath, pure relief crashing over him. "Hey, baby," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You scared the hell out of me." Emily blinked, her gaze unfocused. Her lips parted slightly, voice hoarse from the oxygen mask. "What happened?" John swallowed hard. "You had a setback. The doctors had to drain fluid from your lungs. But you're okay now." She let out a slow, shuddering breath. "The babies?" John smiled softly, his eyes glassy with emotion. "They're still fighting, Em. Just like you." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I need to see them." John pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "And you will. But first, you need to get your strength back." Emily nodded weakly, closing her eyes for a moment. Then, her lips curled into the faintest smile. "You look terrible." John laughed through his tears. "Well, excuse me for not leaving your side, Mrs. Carter." Emily squeezed his hand as exhaustion tugged at her again. But before she drifted off, she whispered, "I love you." John leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you more." And for the first time in weeks, hope felt real. The first steps toward healing the days that followed were a battle, but one Emily was willing to fight. Each day, she pushed herself a little more, sitting up longer, walking short distances, forcing herself to eat even when she had no appetite. She refused to let her body win this time. John was always by her side, encouraging her, holding her up when she was too weak to stand alone. And Rex? He never left her. Whenever Emily struggled, whenever she felt like she couldn't do it, Rex would nudge her hand, lick her fingers, remind her she wasn't alone. "You're my stubborn little guardian, aren't you?" she whispered one morning, scratching behind his ears. The dog simply wagged his tail, his golden eyes shining with quiet understanding. Finally holding her babies 2 weeks after her emergency surgery, Emily was finally strong enough to be wheeled back into the NICU. Her heart pounded as she was led to the incubators, where Caleb and Charlotte lay, still small, still fragile, but alive. A nurse smiled warmly. "They're doing well. We think it's time you held them." Tears immediately burned Emily's eyes. "Really?" John squeezed her shoulder. "You ready, Mama?" Emily nodded quickly, her whole body trembling with emotion. The nurse gently lifted Caleb first, carefully placing him in Emily's arms. The moment their skin touched, Emily let out a broken sob. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I missed you so much." Caleb stirred slightly, his tiny fingers curling against her chest. John wiped at his eyes, looking down at his son, his entire world wrapped in a blanket. Then came Charlotte. She was smaller, more delicate, her breathing still assisted by the machines. But the moment she was placed in Emily's arms, a small, contented sigh left her tiny lips. Emily let out a breathless laugh. "She's perfect." John leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to Charlotte's forehead. "Yeah, she is." Emily sniffled. "We almost didn't make it, did we?" John's throat tightened. "No," he admitted. "But we did." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "We're a family now, John. A real family." John cupped her face, his lips brushing against her forehead. "We always were, sweetheart." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the pain, not the struggles, not the fear of what came next. Because they had each other. And that was everything. A new beginning. A month later, Emily and the babies were finally cleared to go home. The town, once filled with whispers and cruel rumors, had transformed. The people who once judged her were now offering help, meals, support. And Emily? She forgave them, because she had something bigger to focus on. Her family. As John carried the car seat with Caleb and Emily cradled Charlotte, Rex trotted ahead, leading them back to the life they almost lost. John opened the door to their home, stepping aside to let Emily in first. She looked around, inhaling deeply. They were home, and this was just the beginning. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until this point, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.